Close on Vera standing inside a collapsed doorway, the heavy wooden frame rotting above her head. Dust and silence fill the air. She holds a rusted iron key that opens nothing. In the background, the faint sound of water, the Dunmore River, running cold and indifferent just beyond the tree line. They called her the fool's wife. When Vera Hollis lost her husband Edmund, the entire town of Crestwood didn't just grieve alongside her. They pitied her, because Edmund, in the eyes of everyone who knew him, had done the unthinkable. He had taken every dollar they'd saved across 4 decades of quiet, careful living and sunk it all into a crumbling, sealed-up mill on the forgotten edge of town. A building nobody wanted, a property everyone agreed was a liability dressed up as land. And now Vera was alone, 69 years old, standing in front of a padlocked door her husband had never let her open, holding a key she'd found stitched into the lining of his coat the morning after his funeral. But what the town didn't know, what nobody had bothered to consider, was that Edmund Hollis had never once done anything without a reason. And behind that sealed door was a reason that would bring the most powerful men in Crestwood to their knees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vera Hollis had lived in Crestwood, Tennessee for most of her adult life. She'd arrived there at 26 as a newly married woman, following Edmund to the small rural valley where he'd grown up and where his family had roots going back several generations. She'd built her life there, teaching piano lessons out of their home, raising a modest garden, becoming quietly woven into the fabric of the community without ever seeking the spotlight. Edmund had worked as a mechanical engineer for a regional manufacturing firm for most of his career. A quiet and precise man who spoke little but observed everything. He was not the kind of man who made enemies. He was also not the kind of man who made headlines. He was simply there, steady and deliberate, like a well-maintained machine that never broke down and never needed attention. That changed 25 years before his death, when Edmund did something that the town of Crestwood could not stop talking about. He purchased the Iron Gate Mill. The Iron Gate Mill sat on a stretch of land where the Dunmore River curved sharply eastward before widening into the lower valley. It had been built in the 1880s as a grist mill serving the farming communities that once thrived in the region, grinding grain, processing lumber, powering small operations through the force of the river's current. For decades it had been a working landmark, the kind of structure that appeared in old photographs and local history books. But by the time Edmund bought it, the mill had been sealed and abandoned for nearly 40 years. The machinery inside had not turned since the 1970s. The building itself was a deteriorating shell of thick stone walls, warped timber beams, shattered windows, and a roof that had partially caved in on the eastern side. The water wheel, once the heart of the entire structure, sat frozen in the riverbank, encrusted with rust and overgrown with moss and river reeds. Nobody wanted the Iron Gate Mill. The county had tried to auction it off twice and received no serious bids. The land around it was uneven and partially flood-prone. Any development would have required expensive engineering work before a single foundation could be poured. Local developers had looked at it, shrugged, and moved on to easier opportunities. And then Edmund Hollis arrived with a cashier's check and bought it for $22,000. The reaction in Crestwood was immediate and unkind. People talked at the diner on Mercer Street, at the barber shop on the square, at Sunday church gatherings where gossip moved as freely as scripture. Everyone had an opinion. Edmund Hollis had lost his mind. Poor Vera, what a waste. He'd always been a little strange, hadn't he? Kept to himself too much. This was what happened when a man had no real friends to talk him out of his bad ideas. The 3 men who dominated Crestwood's development landscape were particularly vocal in their amusement. Dale Whitmore, who had turned his family's inherited farmland into a profitable network of commercial properties and storage facilities, laughed openly when he heard the news. Gerald Sutton, whose large agricultural estate on the north side of the valley supplied produce to 3 counties, shook his head and said Edmund had paid $20,000 for a pile of rocks and a broken wheel. Boyd Crane, who had recently opened a boutique riverside inn and was actively expanding his hospitality holdings throughout the valley, made a joke about it at a town council meeting that got a good laugh from the room. Vera had heard all of it. She wasn't naive, and she wasn't isolated. She heard what people said about her husband, and she'd made peace with it long ago. Because Vera knew Edmund, she knew the way his mind worked, methodical, patient, and always several steps ahead of where anyone else was looking. He never made careless decisions. He had never once, in 43 years of marriage, done something impulsive or foolish. When she asked him about the mill, he'd looked at her with that quiet, certain expression she'd come to love, and simply said, "It'll matter, Vera. I just need time to work on it." So she let him work. Every weekend, sometimes twice a week, Edmund drove out to the Irongate property in his old blue pickup. He came home with grease on his hands and river mud on his boots. He filled notebooks with diagrams and measurements. He ordered parts from industrial suppliers and carried them out to the mill in unmarked boxes. He spoke to no one about what he was doing, not even Vera, and she didn't push him. If Edmund said it mattered, it mattered. 25 years passed that way. Then Edmund had a stroke at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October, and 3 days later he was gone, and Vera was left standing in front of a sealed mill with a key she didn't know existed, in a town full of people waiting to see how long it would take her to finally admit defeat. She had no idea that defeat was the last thing coming. The morning after Edmund's funeral, Vera sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold before she touched it. She had barely slept. The house felt different without Edmund in it, not just empty but somehow smaller, as though his absence had collapsed the walls inward by a few inches. She was going through the paperwork he'd left behind, trying to make sense of their finances, when she found the first letter. It was from Dale Whitmore's property management company, dated just 4 days before Edmund's death. The language was polite but pointed. The Irongate Mill property, the letter explained, was located in a corridor that Whitmore Development had identified as a priority acquisition zone for an upcoming commercial expansion project. Should Mr. or Mrs. Hollis ever consider selling, the company would be prepared to move quickly and offer fair market compensation. The letter had a handwritten note in the margin, added in a different pen more recently. It said simply, "Now that Edmund is gone, the widow may be more reasonable." Vera read that note 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and set it aside. 2 days later, Dale Whitmore came to her door in person. He was 52, broad-shouldered, and wore the kind of casual confidence that came from a lifetime of being told yes. He expressed his condolences briefly and without much feeling, then moved on to business with the efficiency of a man who considered small talk a waste of his time. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, settling into the armchair across from her without being invited to sit, "I'll be straightforward with you. The Irongate property is a problem. It's been a problem for the valley for years. Edmund, God rest him, had some kind of attachment to it, but the reality is that it's an unsafe, condemned structure sitting on land that could be put to much better use. I'm prepared to offer you $28,000 for the property, the land, and whatever's inside that building." Vera looked at him steadily. "Edmund paid $22,000 for it 25 years ago." "Right. So you'd be making a profit," Dale said, as though this settled the matter entirely. "A small one, sure, but more than that land is worth to anyone reasonable. Take the money, Mrs. Hollis. Use it to make your situation more comfortable. You're on your own now. That mill is the last thing you need to be worrying about." Vera said she would think about it. Dale's expression flickered with mild irritation, but he kept his smile in place and told her not to take too long. He was barely out of the driveway before Gerald Sutton's truck pulled in. Gerald was a large man with a sunburned neck and the slow, deliberate manner of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He was less polished than Dale, but equally certain of himself. He told Vera that the Irongate property sat along a stretch of the Dunmore River that was critical to the irrigation planning he and several neighboring farm operators were developing. He needed that land. He offered her $25,000 and called it generous. Vera thanked him and said she'd consider it. Boyd Crane arrived that same afternoon, which told Vera everything she needed to know about how coordinated this effort was. Boyd was younger than the other two, mid-40s, stylishly dressed, and practiced at being charming. He talked about heritage and community before getting to his offer, $30,000, the highest of the 3. He mentioned that the mill was a danger to anyone who wandered near it, that the roof could collapse, that the riverbank was unstable. He mentioned, almost casually, that a woman her age shouldn't have to carry the burden of a property like that. Vera walked him to the door. That evening she sat alone in her kitchen and placed the rusted iron key on the table in front of her. She'd found it the morning after Edmund's funeral, tucked into the inner lining of his winter coat, sewn in with small, careful stitches that told her it had been placed there deliberately, not hidden in panic, but stored with intention. Edmund had put it there for her to find. 3 men had come to her door in a single day, All three wanted the same property. All three had moved with the speed of people who already had plans drawn up, decisions made, futures imagined, futures that required her to simply step aside and accept what they were offering, which meant the Iron Gate Mill was worth considerably more than any of them were admitting. Vera picked up the key, closed her fingers around it, and made a decision. She would not be selling anything to anyone. Not yet. Not until she understood what her husband had spent 25 years working on behind that sealed door. She was going to the mill. The road to the Iron Gate Mill was little more than a gravel track that split off from the main valley route and wound downhill through a corridor of old oak trees before opening onto the riverbank. Vera had driven it only a handful of times over the years, usually to bring Edmund lunch on long weekend days when she hadn't seen him by mid-afternoon. She had never gone inside the mill. Edmund had always met her at the truck, taken the food with a grateful smile, and gently redirected her attention toward the river view or the way the light fell through the trees. She had never pushed for more. Now, driving Edmund's old blue pickup down that same gravel track alone for the first time, she understood that he had been protecting something. She just didn't know what yet. The mill came into view as she rounded the last bend, and Vera stopped the truck and simply looked at it for a long moment. She had driven past it dozens of times over the decades, but had never really studied it the way she studied it now. The structure was large, larger than she remembered. The walls were built from thick blocks of dark Tennessee limestone that had weathered to a deep charcoal gray over more than a century. Despite the obvious deterioration of the upper sections, where the roof had partially collapsed and vegetation had begun to push through the gaps, the lower walls were remarkably intact, solid, almost defiant in their refusal to fully give way. The water wheel on the riverside was frozen and overgrown, but its framework was still standing, still anchored to the bank where it had been built more than 130 years ago. Vera got out of the truck. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the clean mineral smell of the Dunmore River. Bird song filled the tree line. The water moved steadily past, dark and purposeful. She walked toward the mill's main entrance, a heavy arched doorway framed in hand-cut stone, sealed with a door of thick oak planks reinforced with iron strapping. At the center of the door, an oversized padlock sat in a steel bracket, matte black and conspicuously modern against the aged wood surrounding it. Edmund had installed that lock himself. She could tell by the precision of the bracket work, the way the hardware was fitted flush and even, the kind of careful installation that was his signature in everything he built or repaired. Vera took the key from her coat pocket and fitted it into the lock. It turned on the first try, smoothly, without resistance, as though it had been oiled recently. Which, she realized, it probably had. Edmund had been out here just weeks before his stroke, making his usual rounds. He had maintained this lock the same way he maintained everything, quietly, consistently, without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it at all. The door swung inward on heavy hinges, and Vera stepped inside. The interior of the mill was dim, lit only by the pale morning light filtering through gaps in the roof and the remnants of several high windows whose glass had long since broken away. Dust moved in slow currents through the light. The smell was old wood and stone and river damp, layered with something else, something metallic and faintly mechanical that she couldn't immediately identify. She stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, and then she began to see what was in front of her. The mill was not empty. It was not the gutted, rotting shell that everyone in Crestwood assumed it to be. The ground floor was filled with machinery, not the original grinding equipment that had long since been removed or had rusted into uselessness. What filled the space instead was something entirely different. A complex, carefully arranged system of shafts, gears, belts, and mechanical linkages that covered most of the floor and rose in sections nearly to the ceiling. It was clean, it was organized, and it was clearly, unmistakably, the work of a single meticulous engineer who had spent decades building it piece by piece. Vera walked slowly through the space, trailing her fingers along a shaft housing here, a gear assembly there. Everything was labeled in Edmund's handwriting, small metal tags attached with wire, each one identifying a component, its function, its connection to the next element in the sequence. She recognized his notation system from the engineering journals he kept at home. This was his work, every inch of it. At the far end of the ground floor, a wooden workbench ran the full length of the wall. On it sat neatly organized tools, a logbook, and a large rolled drawing secured with a rubber band. Vera unrolled the drawing and spread it flat on the bench, weighting the corners with nearby tools. It was a schematic, detailed, precise, and comprehensive, and as she began to read it, her breath caught in her chest. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she understood enough to know that Edmund had built something extraordinary inside this mill, something that the town of Crestwood and the 3 men who'd come to her door desperately did not want her to discover. She pulled up a stool and kept reading. The schematic on the workbench was hand-drawn on large engineering paper, the kind Edmund had kept in wide flat rolls in his study at home. Vera had seen him working on drawings like this hundreds of times over the years, bent over his drafting table late at night with a mechanical pencil and a straight edge, producing diagrams of extraordinary precision that she had never fully understood but had always quietly admired. She understood them even less now, standing in the dim light of the mill with river sounds drifting in through the broken windows. But she was patient. She had always been patient, and Edmund had always eventually made his intentions clear. She started from the top left corner of the drawing, the way she had always approached a new piece of music, not jumping ahead, not rushing toward the resolution, but reading every measure in sequence, letting the full picture assemble itself gradually. The schematic showed the Dunmore River, not just the section visible from the mill's bank, but the entire eastern stretch of it, from the point where it entered the valley at the northern ridge all the way down to where it broadened and slowed near the southern farmland. Along its course, the drawing marked a series of points, junctions Vera assumed, where the river's flow connected to other channels. Some of those channels were natural. Others, she could tell from the way they were drawn with precise straight lines and measured angles, were not. They had been engineered, and all of them, every single channel, every junction, every secondary branch of the Dunmore's flow through the eastern valley, converged at a single point on the drawing, a point marked with a small, careful star in Edmund's handwriting. The Iron Gate Mill. Vera set the schematic down and looked around the room with new eyes. The machinery Edmund had built wasn't decorative. It wasn't a hobbyist's project or an eccentric engineer's pastime. It was functional infrastructure, a system of gates and flow controls connected through the mill's mechanical framework to the water wheel outside, which was in turn connected to the river itself. Edmund had spent 25 years rebuilding and extending the mill's original water management function, quietly and without announcement, until the Iron Gate once again controlled the distribution of the Dunmore's flow through the valley. She found the confirmation in the logbook on the workbench. Edmund's handwriting filled page after page with dates, measurements and notations, flow rates, gate positions, seasonal adjustments made to account for changes in water volume. The earliest entries were from shortly after he'd purchased the property. The most recent were from 6 weeks before his stroke, written in the slightly heavier hand that had become his norm in his later years when his joints gave him trouble in cold weather. One entry near the back of the logbook stopped her completely. It was dated 2 years ago, written in the careful, deliberate tone Edmund used when he was recording something he considered important. System fully operational, all primary gates responsive. Eastern agricultural channels confirmed flowing at optimal rate. Henderson Road residential drainage confirmed connected and dependent. Crane Riverside development confirmed reliant on secondary eastern fork for flood buffer. Sutton farmland confirmed drawing from northern branch. All 3 major operations in the valley now fully dependent on Iron Gate flow management. I have said nothing and will say nothing, but Vera will need to know. I will leave her the key and the logbook and trust her to understand what I could not say out loud. Vera read the entry twice. Then she sat down heavily on the stool and pressed her hands flat on the workbench to steady herself. Dale Whitmore's commercial properties relied on the valley's drainage infrastructure. Gerald Sutton's farmland depended on the northern branch of the Dunmore for its irrigation supply. Boyd Crane's Riverside Inn and his expanding hospitality developments sat directly in the flood path that only remained dry because of the Eastern Fork's careful management through the Iron Gate system. All 3 men, the 3 most powerful landowners and developers in Crestwood, Tennessee, had built their empires on water that flowed at Edmund Hollis's discretion. And now at Vera's, she stood and walked slowly to the large central mechanism on the mill floor, a cast-iron gate control connected by a shaft system to the primary river junction. The wheel was enormous, nearly 5 feet across, its spokes worn smooth in places where hands had gripped them over decades of operation. A brass plate was mounted on the wall beside it, green with age. Primary Eastern Valley Flow Control. Operation of this gate directly affects all downstream agricultural and residential water access. Owner of record holds exclusive operational authority per original mill deed and water rights charter of 1887. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Vera put both hands on the wheel. The metal was cold beneath her palms. She did not turn it. Not yet. But she felt the weight of it, the real weight, not just the physical resistance of cast iron and years, but the weight of what it represented. Every acre of farmland Gerald Sutton owned, every guest room Boyd Crane had built along the river, every storage facility and commercial lot Dale Whitmore had developed on the valley floor, all of it dependent on water, all of it dependent on this wheel, all of it, whether they knew it or not, dependent on her. The widow they had dismissed in a single afternoon had just discovered she was holding the valley in her hands. Vera spent 3 more hours in the mill that first morning, going through every page of Edmund's logbook and cross-referencing his notes with the schematic on the workbench. By the time she locked the door behind her and walked back to the truck, she had a clear enough picture of what the system did and how it worked. Not the full technical depth, that would take weeks to absorb completely, but enough. Enough to understand the leverage she held, enough to understand why 3 men had appeared at her door within 48 hours of her husband's funeral, with cash offers and barely concealed urgency. She drove back to town and stopped at the office of Margaret Collier, a property and water rights attorney who had handled a land dispute for Vera's neighbor several years back. Vera laid out the situation plainly: the mill, the water rights charter, Edmund's logbook, the brass plate on the wall. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Vera appreciated about her. When Vera finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a legal pad and began writing. "The 1887 Water Rights Charter is the foundation," Margaret said. "If it's properly recorded with the county, and it almost certainly is because Edmund would have verified that before he ever spent $1 on that property, then the operational authority is unambiguous. The owner of the Iron Gate Mill controls the water, not the county, not the developers. You," she looked up from the pad, "don't sell anything to anyone until I've pulled the full records, and don't let anyone on that property without your permission." Vera thanked her and drove home. The call from Dale Whitmore came that same evening. His tone had shifted slightly from the measured politeness of his visit, carrying now a faint edge that he wasn't quite disciplined enough to conceal. He had heard, he said, that Vera had been out to the mill. He wanted to reiterate that his offer was still on the table, that it was a fair offer, and that the longer the property sat in its current condition, the more it became a liability rather than an asset. He used the word liability 3 times in the space of 2 minutes, which told Vera he was nervous. She told him she was still considering her options and ended the call. 2 days later, all 3 men came to her property together. Dale Whitmore, Gerald Sutton, and Boyd Crane pulled up in Dale's truck, the kind of coordinated arrival that was meant to communicate weight and finality. Vera saw them from the kitchen window and took her time before going to the door. She made them wait on the porch for a full 2 minutes, then stepped outside with her coat on and her arms folded. "Mrs. Hollis," Dale began, his voice carrying the careful evenness of a man rehearsing a script, "we've been patient and we respect your grief, we genuinely do, but we need to be direct with you. The Iron Gate property is creating complications for several ongoing development projects in the valley. We've pooled our resources and we're prepared to offer you $55,000 for the property, the land and all contents. That is a final collective offer and we won't be going higher." Vera looked at each of them in turn. Gerald Sutton was staring at his boots. Boyd Crane was watching her with a practiced expression of sympathetic reason that didn't reach his eyes. Dale held her gaze, but his jaw was tight. "You pooled your resources," Vera said. "All 3 of you. That's right. You must want it very badly. We want to resolve the situation fairly," Boyd said smoothly, "for everyone involved. And if I say no..." Dale's expression shifted, the rehearsed patience giving way to something cooler beneath. "Then we'll have no choice but to pursue legal remedies. The mill is an unsafe structure. It's a public hazard. The county has grounds to condemn it, and if they do, the compensation would be considerably less than what we're offering you today." Vera let the threat settle in the air between them without reacting to it. Then she spoke quietly and clearly. The county can certainly attempt condemnation. My attorney will be very interested in discussing that process, particularly in the context of the 1887 Water Rights Charter that vests exclusive operational authority over the Eastern Valley's water flow in the legal owner of this property. She paused. Which is me. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Gerald Sutton looked up from his boots. Boyd Crane's practiced expression dissolved. Dale Whitmore stared at her with the look of a man who has just realized that the conversation he thought he was controlling has been running in the opposite direction the entire time. You know, Dale said slowly. I know everything, Vera said. My husband was a very thorough man. Now I'd like you to leave my property. When you come back, and you will come back, I expect it to be with respect and a serious conversation, not threats and pooled offers designed to make me feel cornered. She went inside and closed the door. The three men didn't come back the next day or the day after that. What came instead were lawyers. Dale Whitmore retained the most prominent land use attorney in the county, a man named Preston Hale who had a reputation for burying small property owners in paperwork until they surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. Gerald Sutton filed a formal complaint with the county water authority, claiming that the Iron Gate Mill's mechanical systems constituted an illegal modification of a protected waterway. Boyd Crane's legal team submitted a petition to the County Planning Board requesting an emergency structural assessment of the mill with the implied aim of triggering a condemnation order. Vera received all three actions within the same week. She brought everything to Margaret Collier's office and spread it across the conference table without comment. Margaret reviewed each filing methodically, making notes in the margin of each document in her small, precise handwriting. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. They're trying to overwhelm you, she said. Generate enough legal noise that you either run out of money to fight it or decide it isn't worth the stress. It's a standard pressure campaign against a solo property owner who they assume has limited resources and no appetite for prolonged conflict. They've made a lot of assumptions about me, Vera said. Margaret smiled. They have. Let's correct them. Over the following 2 weeks, Margaret filed responses to all three actions with a thoroughness that made clear to opposing counsel that this was not a widow who could be papered into submission. The Water Authority complaint was dismissed within days. The 1887 charter was precisely as airtight as Edmund had known it to be when he'd bought the property, the operational authority unambiguous and fully recorded with the county. The condemnation petition stalled when the structural assessment revealed that the mill's limestone walls were in considerably better condition than anyone had expected, and that the internal machinery, far from being a hazard, was a functioning and maintained system of genuine historical significance. Preston Hale's filing was met with a counter-filing that quietly cited 3 separate precedents establishing that water rights attached to a private deed could not be reclassified as public infrastructure without full compensation to the property owner, compensation that, given the scope of the valley's dependence on the Iron Gate system, would have run into the millions. The legal campaign against Vera collapsed in under a month. But the pressure didn't stop entirely. Dale Whitmore began making calls around town, subtle and not so subtle, suggesting that Vera was being unreasonable, that she was holding the valley hostage, that a grieving widow had somehow gotten it into her head that she was more important than the community she lived in. It was the kind of social pressure that had worked on people in Crestwood before, the soft force of collective opinion marshaled against someone who had made themselves inconvenient. What Dale hadn't counted on was that Vera had lived in Crestwood for 43 years. She knew people. She had taught piano to half the children in the valley at one point or another. She had sat with neighbors during illness, helped organize the church fundraiser for 12 consecutive years, brought food to families in difficulty without announcement or expectation. She was not a stranger who had wandered in from outside and made demands. She was one of them, and the people who actually knew her recognized the difference between a woman asserting her legal rights and a woman causing trouble for its own sake. Support came quietly but steadily. Her neighbor Frances brought over a casserole and told her to hold firm. The owner of the hardware store on the square told her he'd always thought Dale Whitmore was a bully. 2 farmers on the south side of the valley, men who had no connection to the 3 developers and whose small operations sat outside the primary drainage network, stopped by separately to say they hoped she wouldn't be pushed around. Then Vera did something that changed the dynamic entirely. She drove out to the mill, descended to the primary gate control, and partially closed the valve governing the flow to Dale Whitmore's commercial properties on the eastern corridor. Not enough to cause flooding, just enough to reduce the drainage rate by 30%, producing the kind of persistent ground saturation that made commercial lots difficult to maintain and unpleasant for tenants. She made no announcement. She sent no message. She simply adjusted the valve, recorded the change in Edmund's logbook, and drove home. Within 4 days, Dale Whitmore's property management company began receiving complaints from 3 of his commercial tenants about standing water in their parking areas and drainage backups in their service bays. Dale called a plumber, then another plumber, then an engineer. None of them could identify the source of the problem because none of them knew about the iron gate system. But Dale knew, and on the 5th day he called Vera's phone and asked, very quietly, if they could meet. Of course, Vera said. Come on Thursday, come alone, and come ready to have a real conversation. The valley was beginning to understand something important. Vera Hollis was not temporary. She was not a problem that would resolve itself. She was not the fool's wife or the grieving widow or the old woman who didn't know what she had. She was the keeper of the Iron Gate Mill, and the Iron Gate Mill held the Eastern Valley in its hands, and she had only just begun. Dale Whitmore arrived on Thursday morning without his truck, without his lawyers, and without the rehearsed confidence that had accompanied every previous interaction. He came in a regular sedan, parked quietly at the end of Vera's driveway, and knocked on the front door with the measured knock of a man who understood he was no longer the one setting the terms. Vera let him in, offered him coffee, and waited while he settled himself at the kitchen table with the slightly stiff posture of someone unaccustomed to being in a position of vulnerability. He apologized first, which surprised her. It was not a polished apology, not the kind delivered by people who had practiced it in the mirror or workshopped it with a publicist. It was halting and imperfect and genuine in the way that only uncomfortable things are genuine. He said he had underestimated her. He said the note in the margin of his letter, the one about the widow being more reasonable, had been thoughtless and cruel, and he knew it. He said that he and the other 2 men had approached the situation with the assumption that grief and financial pressure would make her pliable, and that he was not proud of that calculation. Vera listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her coffee cup and looked at him steadily. Edmund maintained that system for 25 years, she said. He drove out to that mill in the rain, in the cold, in the heat of August, every week, sometimes twice a week, for 25 years. He replaced parts with his own money. He kept records no one asked him to keep. He ensured that the water flowed correctly through this valley so that farms produced and developments stayed dry and businesses operated without interruption. And in all that time, not one person in this town asked him how the drainage worked, or why it worked, or whether anyone was maintaining it. They just assumed it worked because it always had. Dale said nothing. He never asked for payment, Vera continued. He never asked for recognition. He just did the work because he understood that the system mattered and someone had to be responsible for it. What I am asking now is not revenge, Mr. Whitmore. It is simply the acknowledgement of value that should have been acknowledged a long time ago. Dale nodded slowly. What do you want? Vera had spent the previous week preparing for this question with Margaret's help. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. On it were the terms she was proposing, clear, fair, and non-negotiable. An annual maintenance contract, paid jointly by Whitmore, Sutton, and Crane, based on a percentage of each operation's assessed revenue from Valley properties. The combined payment would come to $65,000 per year, reviewed every 5 years for adjustment. In addition, the 3 developers would collectively fund a complete professional restoration of the Iron Gate Mill, not a demolition and rebuild, but a careful, historically sensitive restoration that preserved the original structure while making it fully functional and safe. The water rights and operational authority would remain with Vera in perpetuity, transferable only through her own estate and on her own terms. And finally, a formal public acknowledgement at the next town council meeting of Edmund Hollis's 25 years of unpaid stewardship of the valley's water system. Dale read the terms twice. The public acknowledgement, he said carefully, that will require Gerald and Boyd to agree as well. Then I suggest you persuade them, Vera said. You have until Monday. He left with the paper folded in his breast pocket, and Vera watched his sedan disappear down the road with the calm certainty of a woman who had already decided how this would end. Gerald Sutton came Saturday. He was less polished than Dale in his apology, but more visibly shaken, the kind of man whose entire identity was built on the solidity of his land and who had not previously been forced to confront the fact that the land's productivity depended on something outside his control. He agreed to the terms without significant negotiation, asked only that the payment schedule be structured quarterly rather than annually, which Vera accepted as a reasonable request. Boyd Crane came Sunday evening. He arrived with a bottle of good Tennessee whiskey, which Vera quietly set aside, and spent the first 15 minutes trying to renegotiate the percentage calculation for his properties on the grounds that his riverside development was newer and therefore had less accumulated benefit from the historical system. Vera listened patiently, then told him that newer development was precisely why the percentage was appropriate, as the Eastern Forks flood buffer had been the deciding factor in whether his riverside inn was even buildable. Boyd stopped arguing and signed. By Sunday night, all three men had agreed. Margaret drafted the formal contracts Monday morning, and by Wednesday of the following week, all three signatures were in place. That Thursday evening, Vera drove out to the mill alone. She unlocked the door, walked through the machinery floor, and stood at the central gate control with her hands resting on the large wheel. She reached down and carefully, fully reopened the valve she had partially closed 2 weeks earlier. She watched the flow rate indicator rise to its optimal position and recorded the adjustment in Edmund's logbook in her own handwriting for the first time. Then she sat on the old wooden stool at the workbench and allowed herself, for the first time since Edmund's funeral, to feel something other than the focused, necessary tension of a woman under siege. She felt relief. She felt the particular satisfaction of a battle not just won, but won correctly, on terms she had set, without cruelty, without excess, with the same quiet precision Edmund had brought to everything he built. She stayed until the light outside the broken windows had faded completely, listening to the river move past in the darkness, steady and indifferent and eternal, carrying the valley forward the way it always had. The restoration of the Iron Gate Mill took 8 months. Vera supervised every stage of it personally, driving out to the property each morning with Edmund's original schematic rolled under her arm and a notebook of her own filling steadily with observations, questions, and decisions. The contractors hired by the 3 developers were professional and skilled, but Vera made clear from the first day that the work would follow her specifications, not theirs. The mill's limestone walls were cleaned and repointed by a mason who specialized in historic stonework. The roof was rebuilt using timber milled from the same species of oak as the original, sourced from a sustainable operation 2 counties over. The water wheel was dismantled, each component catalogued and either restored or precisely replicated, then reassembled on the original axle mounts Edmund had reinforced during his years of quiet work. The machinery Edmund had built on the mill floor was preserved completely. A young structural engineer named Diane Marsh, no relation to anyone in the story but coincidentally sharing a name that made Vera smile every time she used it, was brought in to assess the system and provide a full technical documentation of its design. Diane spent 2 weeks in the mill with the schematics and logbooks, and on the last day she came to find Vera at the workbench with an expression that Vera recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had just understood something extraordinary. "Mrs. Hollis," Diane said, setting the logbook down carefully, "how long did you say your husband worked on this system?" 25 years, Vera said. Diane was quiet for a moment. "This is one of the most elegant water management designs I've ever seen. The way he integrated the original Victorian infrastructure with modern flow control principles, without disrupting the historical mechanisms, without requiring any external power source. It's entirely gravity and river pressure driven. She paused, searching for the right word. "It's brilliant." Vera looked at the machinery around them, at the shafts and gears and gate controls that Edmund had assembled piece by careful piece across a quarter-century of solitary weekends. "Yes," she said simply, "he was." The public acknowledgement at the town council meeting took place on a Tuesday evening in November, 6 months after the contracts were signed. The hall was fuller than usual. Word had spread about what was happening, not in the way that gossip spread in Crestwood, fast and distorted, but in the slower, more considered way that genuine news traveled, person to person, with a quality of quiet significance attached to it. Dale Whitmore stood at the podium and read a formal statement acknowledging Edmund Hollis's 25 years of unpaid stewardship of the valley's water system. Gerald Sutton and Boyd Crane sat in the front row. None of them looked comfortable, which Vera considered appropriate. Discomfort in the service of honesty was a fair price. When Dale finished, the council chairwoman invited Vera to say a few words. Vera stood and looked out at the assembled faces of people she had lived alongside for 4 decades. She kept it brief. "Edmund never wanted recognition," she said. "He wanted the system to work. He wanted the valley to thrive. He wanted to leave something behind that mattered. He did all of those things quietly and without asking anything in return. And I think that says more about the kind of man he was than anything I could add. What I'll say for myself is this: I came very close to walking away. The morning after his funeral, with 3 offers on the table and a property I didn't understand, and a town that seemed very certain I had nothing worth keeping. The easier path was obvious. I'm glad I didn't take it. She sat down. The applause was genuine and sustained, and Vera accepted it with the still composure of a woman who had earned it and knew it and needed nothing more from it than the acknowledgement itself. 5 years after Edmund's death, Vera established the Edmund Hollis Foundation for Rural Engineering Heritage, a small non-profit that provided grants to young engineers studying sustainable water management and historical infrastructure preservation. Diane was its first board member. The foundation's first project was a comprehensive survey of historic water systems in rural Tennessee, several of which had been quietly deteriorating for decades without anyone taking responsibility for their maintenance. The Erringate Mill became a landmark, not a tourist attraction, not a museum piece, but a living, functioning piece of infrastructure that continued to do exactly what it had been built to do in 1887, carry the Eastern Valley's water where it needed to go, season after season, year after year. Vera made her daily walk to check the valves every morning without exception, recording flow rates in the logbook that now bore both Edmund's handwriting and her own in equal measure. On the morning of her 75th birthday, Vera stood at the central gate control in the restored mill and rested her hands on the large wheel the way she had on the very first day she'd found it. The brass plate on the wall beside it still read what it had always read: "Owner of record holds exclusive operational authority." She had repainted the letters herself the previous spring, carefully, following the original engraving stroke by stroke. She thought about the woman she had been 6 years earlier, sitting in a cold kitchen with a rusted key and a future that looked like nothing but loss and difficulty. She thought about how close she had come to accepting that version of her story, the one where the widow sold the mill and moved somewhere comfortable and let the thing Edmund had built disappear into someone else's development plan. She thought about Diane's expression when she'd understood what Edmund had made, about Francis bringing a casserole and telling her to hold firm, about the town council hall full of people who had come to hear a dead engineer finally receive his due, about the quiet, accumulated weight of doing the right thing for long enough that the right thing eventually becomes undeniable. Edmund had left her a sealed mill and a key stitched into the lining of his coat. He had left her 25 years of logbooks and a schematic drawn with a steady hand and the absolute faith that she would find it, read it, understand it, and hold it. He had left her everything she needed and trusted her completely with all of it. She had not let him down. Vera adjusted the valve by a quarter turn, correcting a minor seasonal flow variation she had learned to anticipate every November, recorded the change in the logbook, and walked back up into the morning light. The Dunmore River moved past the mill the way it always had, carrying the valley forward without hurry or hesitation, steady and purposeful, and entirely indifferent to the opinions of those who had once looked at this place and seen nothing worth keeping. Vera locked the door behind her, put the key in her coat pocket, and drove home through the oak corridor with the window down and the cold Tennessee air filling the cab of Edmund's old blue pickup, which she had never once considered selling. Some things you keep, not because they are easy, and not because the world tells you they are worth keeping. You keep them because you made a promise, and because the person who trusted you with them knew, even when you didn't, exactly what they were worth. The fool's wife had become the queen of the Erringate, and the valley that had laughed at her husband would spend the rest of its years grateful that she had trusted him too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.